Hello and welcome to this Unit 4 revision video for 4.4 Social Policies, which is going to talk about young people, women and the churches, as well as the extent to which the Nazis achieved the Volksgemeinschaft. Now it mentions about the workers on here as well, as that's part of Unit 4.4, but that's actually dealt with in the 4.3 Economic Policies video. So if you want to hear about the workers, you'll need to go back to that video and watch from 35 minutes onwards. As always, it's a really good idea to start with a red pen, black pen activity, brainstorming what you know about these different groups. So we're thinking here about young people, women, workers, and the policies towards the church. And you might also want to, when you're brainstorming, think about how these different groups were affected over time, and were all people within these different groups affected the same way by Nazi policies. So it's a really good idea to pause that video now and write down what you can already remember so that you're aware when you're watching the video what your weaker areas are. Now, if you get given an exam question for Unit 4.4 about social policies, they'll probably phrase it in a way where they'll ask you about to what extent did the Nazis achieve the Volksgemeinschaft. So it's really important that you understand what that term means and that you're able to define it in an introduction. Now, obviously, when we think about the Volksgemeinschaft, we're thinking about it being the people's community. And this was the idea of having this new unified German nation. Now, as we know from thinking about Unit 4.2 and about how the Nazis wanted to create a terror state, we know that they wanted to make sure that there were no independent organisations that stood in their way. They didn't want independent thought. They wanted Germany to be working together as one unified nation. So they used propaganda, indoctrination, terror and repression to try and achieve this and make sure that everybody was part of the Volksgemeinschaft and they were loyal. Now, in terms of whether the Nazis revolutionised society, that is something that is up for debate. Generally, though, Hitler's new society that he aimed for didn't require major changes to the social structure, but instead just required the people to make sure that they had a greater consciousness about the idea of being German and about working together as a community. The members of the Volksgemeinschaft were supposed to be people that were socially efficient, politically reliable and committed to the regime, and Aryan as well. So people that didn't fit into this ideal people's community were seen as outsiders, hence all of the different treatment of asocials and Jews that we'll look at when we get to Unit 5. So pause the video here if you want to make any notes about Nazi social policies or write down your own definition of the Volksgemeinschaft. The first group we're going to think about is policies towards the youth. Now, the youth were incredibly important to the Nazis for a few different reasons, but the crucial one is that the Nazis believed that if they could indoctrinate the youth when they were younger, they would be able to prevent future opposition. Remember that the Nazis were aiming for the 1,000-year Reich, and therefore they needed to win the support of people when they were younger to make it easier for them in the future. You know, they needed the young people to be the future soldiers or the future mothers of Germany, and also the future workers of Germany as well, where they'd be able to achieve all of their economic aims. So they needed them to be able to fully consolidate their position. Now, the Nazis tried to win over the young people in a few different ways. The crucial ones are thinking about how they used education as propaganda and also how they controlled their free time with the Hitler Youth and the League of German Maidens. We can see the importance of education through this quote from Rust, who was the Nazi education minister, who said that the purpose of school is to train human beings to realise that the state is more important than the individual. So that's going back to the idea again of Volksgemeinschaft and achieving this people's community of this unified collective of German people. So you all need to know about what policies they brought in for both schools and universities as well. So in terms of schools, this was the Nazis' main priority, as obviously there were more children going to school than there were going to university. Now, they tried to control the schools in two different ways. The first way was about trying to control the teachers. So it started in 1933 with the law for the restoration of professional civil service that basically sacked not only Jewish but also politically unreliable people from their positions in places like the civil service, but also within some state jobs as well, for instance, teachers. So anybody that was seen as being politically unreliable or even a Jewish teacher was sacked straight away in April 1933. The Nazis also wanted to control teachers by expecting them to join the National Socialist Teachers League, the NSLB. Now, this was an organisation that would put on summer camps for teachers that were seen as politically unreliable, ones that maybe wouldn't have been seen as a major threat to have been dismissed straight away, but ones where they questioned their loyalty at first. During those training camps that would take place during the summer holidays, they would be politically indoctrinated to try and make sure that they were convincing the German school children of Nazi ideology. And it was incredibly successful. And by 1937, 97% of teachers had joined this organisation. A historian called Fest even argued that they were incredibly successful with teachers, and that actually teachers were one of the most politically reliable sections of society. So that's the first way that they controlled schools. The second way was that they completely changed the curriculum. So from 1935, there were central directives issued by the Ministry of Education covering what should be taught, and by 1938, these rules covered every school year and most subjects. Now, even before 1935, there was certainly an emphasis on Nazi ideology, even if it wasn't as centrally coordinated as it became after 1935. The Nazis wanted to try and achieve a lot through their curriculum and indoctrinate children from a young age. So they put in place lots of different emphasis on certain subjects and made sure that Nazi ideas came through these subjects. For instance, the Nazis really cared about the idea of racial health in order to achieve the Volksgemeinschaft as this genetically healthy group of people, and therefore they placed a greater emphasis on PE, and they had up to 2 hours a day, or over 15% of their curriculum time, just on PE. They also changed textbooks and made sure that Nazi ideas came across through these new textbooks as well. For instance, in science lessons, they started to have separate lessons on eugenics, where they would teach them this false science, where there was an idea that certain races were supposedly better than others, and that would be taught within those science lessons. When it came to subjects like German, they made sure that they were studying, classic German texts and talking about what it was to be a German citizen. When it came to things like history, they taught about things like the stab in the back myth, and they tried to glorify German military victories in the past too. When it came to things like maths, they tried to make sure they were politically loaded questions, for instance about calculating the cost of disabled care. So schools were used to try and indoctrinate German children from a young age, and they were really successful in doing this. In terms of university, the Nazis didn't really like university generally because they didn't like the idea of it teaching you independent thought. So they downgraded the importance of academic education, and as a result, the number of students attending university decreased. To be successful in Nazi Germany, you didn't require a degree. Instead, you were required to be somebody that was politically loyal, and you didn't need to have gone to university to achieve that. If you were a boy, you might have gone to one of the specialist schools, for instance, the Napolers, or the Order Castles, or the Adolf Hitler schools, and you would be more likely to be successful having gone to one of those than just having gone to university. The Nazis wanted to try and limit the access to universities, so they tried to make sure that students were chosen on political grounds and who was politically reliable. Women were restricted to only 10% of the admissions, and Jews were restricted to 1.5%. However, by 1938, they couldn't get a formal education at all. Now, just like with how they tried to control teachers in schools through the National Socialist Teachers League, they also tried to make sure that they controlled the university staff as well. And as a result of that same law that they put in place in April 1933 for the civil service, 15% of university staff were dismissed from their jobs on the grounds that they weren't politically reliable or they were Jewish. The Nazis also tried to control universities by making all students join the German Students' League, although up to 25% of students didn't join this. They also tried to get them to do 4 months of labour service while they were at university to try and teach them about real life. As I said before, they didn't really believe in the importance of an academic education. Now, in terms of universities, they were actually very successful there because the universities were generally a breeding ground for nationalistic ideas, and obviously that suited Nazi ideology. So in terms of educational policies, the Nazis were really successful at trying to control schools, and they were able to control the teachers really successfully as well. They didn't just care about controlling them during the school hours though, they also wanted to control them in their free time hence the emphasis on the Hitler Youth. The term the Hitler Youth is often used to describe all of the different youth organisations in Nazi Germany, but that's not officially what it was. The Hitler Youth officially, or the HJ, was just for boys between the age of 10 and 18. Now, this was a group that was all about preparing them for their future roles as soldiers in German society. Hence, we can see this in their motto of live faithfully, fight bravely, and die laughing. Now, this was an organisation that had been around since 1926, when the Nazis were still trying to consolidate their position after the Munich Purge. However, it didn't become popular until 1933. In 1933, millions of young boys had joined the Hitler Youth voluntarily after other youth groups had been closed down and because the Nazis were seen as such a desirable party to be part of, and the Hitler Youth activities were very popular with young boys. They used to do lots of things, including camping and hiking. They would do lots of sports. They would try and do lots of military training and leadership roles and preparing them for those future roles in society. And at first, people found it really fun. We can see by the fact that by 1937, 1 million members of the Hitler Youth had actually attended the youth camps in the summer. Now, the Nazis did try and put increasing pressure on young boys to join this over time. In 1933, they had got rid of basically all of the other youth groups except the Catholic groups, because remember they had the Concordat agreement with the Catholic Church. By the time we get to 1936, the Nazis had tried to put increasing pressure on young boys to join the Hitler Youth movement by giving it the status of an official education movement, and it gave them a monopoly over sports facilities. So essentially, if you wanted to do any kind of sporting activity, you had to be part of the Hitler Youth because they owned all of those buildings and all those facilities. By the time we get to 1939, the Nazis had made it completely compulsory. However, not every single member of the youth went to the Hitler Youth meetings, and actually only 77% were formal members of the Hitler Youth by the time we get to 1939. The League of German Maidens was the equivalent of the Hitler Youth for girls between the ages of 10 and 18. Now, this was formed in 1938 by their leader, Jutta Rüdiger, who came up with the motto, be faithful, be pure, be German. And this summarises the idea of the League of German Maidens and what they were trying to prepare them for in the future. The idea was to try and prepare them for their future roles in German society as a wife and mother and homemaker, and to make sure that they were fully indoctrinated into National Socialist ideology. They carried out lots of fitness activities, just like the boys did, including doing things like group gymnastics to try and raise their fitness and also help them to develop a sense of community. Just like the Hitler Youth as well, the idea was about trying to get rid of the idea of different classes and bringing together a range of different people. For working class girls in particular, this gave them lots of new opportunities that they'd never had before. Now, some of the activities that they did here was quite similar to school. For instance, teaching them about National Socialist ideology and also teaching them skills like sewing and cooking, which was something they would do in their home economics classes within schools. Now, generally, the BDM was popular, just like the Hitler Youth was. Some historians argue this was even more popular with the girls than it was with the boys, because for many girls, it gave them so much more freedom than they'd ever had before. For instance, the girls were allowed to travel without their parents. And actually, by 1937, 100,000 members of the BDM had attended youth camps. However, it wasn't always completely popular with all girls, and there were some things that the Nazis did that were pretty unpopular. For instance, from 1934, they tried to get girls to do a year's work on the land or in domestic service to give them practical experience of childcare and put them in touch with their domestic roots. That's when they got older. And this was really unpopular with the girls, as the boys didn't necessarily have to do the equivalent, but it was made compulsory anyway in 1939. For Unit 4.4, it's really important that you understand the change over time. Now, if you're asked a question about the youth or about the workers, they might expect you to try and talk about a range of different time periods, thinking about, for instance, between 1933 and 1939, and then also thinking about the impact of World War II on these groups, which we'll come back to when we do Unit 6. So for the youth, there were quite a few changes between 1933 and 1939 for both the boys and the girls. Now, generally, the Hitler Youth, whether it was the HJ or the BDM, was generally met with a lot of enthusiasm, and some historians say that the BDM was even more popular with girls than the Hitler Youth was with boys. This is because both of these organisations gave young people with an unprecedented opportunity to challenge traditional authority such as parents and teachers, and also provided them with lots of opportunities to socialise with other new young people. However, for both of them, they started to become frustrated over time as they had less freedom about what they did, and they had to give up their weekends consistently to do the same sorts of activities. For a lot of young people, they found it quite frustrating that it became more bureaucratic and rigid over time, and that made it less attractive. For instance, the idea that they were being more forced to join from 1936 after it became an official youth movement, and then the fact that it becomes compulsory from 1939 was again very unpopular with young people. And if we think about the impact of World War II that we'll look at later when we get to Unit 6, and to see that the young boys had to do even greater military drill. Some children actually ended up being hospitalised because of these long marches that they were having to do without very many resources to support them. And for the girls, they had to do a lot of work as well in the Second World War, for instance, doing things like collecting money for the Winter Relief Programme. Important to think about to what extent there was opposition from the youth, which is going back to Unit 4.2 when we looked at the totalitarian state. Now, generally, as we've seen, the Nazis were very successful with young people. They were successful in terms of their control over education, and they were successful at winning around the majority of people to the Hitler Youth and League of German Maidens. A historian called Will even estimated that up to 95% of the German youth supported the Nazis before the Second World War. And it's certainly true that this was the largest organisation for young people to ever exist in the Western world. There were lots of young people, lots of young boys in particular, that fought with fanatical commitment to the Second World War, and lots of girls that put a lot of effort into supporting the war effort as well. However, even in this period of 1933 to 1939, the Nazis did fail to some extent with some of the young people. For instance, there were lots of young people that became increasingly disillusioned with the regime. For instance, they were doing things like allowing their membership to lapse, even though it became compulsory from 1939. Remember that only 77% of people were members in that year. They could also do things like not attending weekly parades, humming banned tunes. And for some young people, they saw that as just being kind of standard teenage rebelliousness. However, for the Nazis, they saw it as a genuine threat, and they saw that as genuine opposition to the regime. By the end of the 1930s, it's true that many thousands of young people were turning away from the Hitler Youth and the BDM and forming their own independent gangs, which there had been a history of even in Weimar during the so-called Golden Years. Now, there are two really crucial groups to know about in this period before the Second World War, and that is the Edelweiss Pirates and the Swing Youth. Another group you'll need to know later on is the White Rose, but they don't really become active until the Second World War. So the first group to know about is the Edelweiss Pirates, which is a collection of different mini groups who's just given that collective name. It wasn't one official gang that had formed. These originated mainly amongst working class communities in the west of the country, and they would do things like singing anti-Nazi songs, refusing to participate in Hitler Youth activities, and doing things like fighting with members of the Hitler Youth. However, during the Second World War, they became much more political in their opposition, and they were doing things like helping escaped prisoners of war. The Swing Youth were different in class. They were generally members of the middle class, and their opposition took the form of preferring English and American cultural influences, such as things like jazz music and swing, and also doing things like wearing clothing like jeans as well. Their behaviour was regarded as degenerate by the Nazis. So there were some different groups of opposition that formed in this period, even though the Nazis were largely successful at winning round the youth. This is the last slide on the youth, and it's really important that you pause it here and start to think about your own view on whether the Nazis were able to win the hearts and minds of the youth, and to what degree they were successful in winning them over. Now, to help you with this, there are a few different historians' views on this slide, which you could use to support some of your arguments if you wanted to. You don't need to know them all. I've picked out the three that I think are the crucial ones to know that I might use in an exam answer, but it's up to you which ones fit with your idea or which ones you're going to use to maybe even critique different historians' views as well. So pause the video here if you want to make any notes on these historians' views. The best ones I think are for Wilt, about estimating 95% of the youth. You could also think about Puker, who talks about a criticism of that, and basically the idea that they were facing a massive opposition movement by the late 1930s. Or you could even think about Hausen's view, who talks about the fact that the youth knew no alternative to Nazis, but despite all of this, their support for Hitler was less than total. So the next group you need to know about is Nazi policies towards women that can be summarised in Hitler's views here of the different roles of men and women. So they said in 1934, if the man's world is said to be the state, his struggle, his readiness to devote his powers to the service of the community, then it may perhaps be said that the woman's is a smaller world. Her world is her husband, her family, her children, and her home. And that certainly summarises Nazi policies towards women. Now, the really crucial policy towards women is the idea that they wanted women to have more children because they were worried about the declining birth rate. But lots of the other aims fit into this same aim of trying to get women to have more children. First of all, they wanted to reverse the changes of the new woman from the Weimar Republic. For instance, the new woman was supposed to be one that was supposed to be sexually free, and they encouraged the use of contraception much more during this period. The Nazis wanted to reverse those changes, and obviously they didn't want women using contraceptives if they wanted women to have more children. They also didn't like the fact that in the Weimar Republic, more women had more freedom to be able to work and access to different jobs. The Nazis wanted to reverse those changes as well. They generally wanted to reduce female employment, and also to make sure that women were good wives and mothers. They wanted to try and organise and incorporate women into the Volksgemeinschaft and teach them how to be those good wives and good mothers. There are three key policies towards women that we're going to go through and think about the individual success of each of these policies. So first of all, the Nazis wanted to try and increase the birth rate because, as we already know, the birth rate was decreasing, and actually by the time we get to 1933 there were only half as many German children born in 1933 than there were in the year 1900. Now the Nazis saw that as a real concern because they're thinking about the future of the Thousand-Year Reich, they're thinking about the military strength of Germany in the future, and they know that they need to increase the birth rate in order to achieve the great status that they were hoping to achieve over time. So the policies that they were put in place to try and increase the birth rate then. First of all, they tried to make sure that there was financial benefits to having a family, because that had been one of the crucial reasons why less people were having children after the Great Depression in 1933. So straight away, in the year they came to power, they introduced marriage loans, about 1,000 Reichsmarks. The idea being that you kept a quarter for each of the children that you had. So if you had 4 children, you would be able to keep the full amount. That wasn't the only financial benefit that they introduced. They also reduced income tax, and if you had 6 children, you didn't have to pay any money at all in terms of income tax. So that was another financial benefit for having children. They also celebrated every year on Hitler's mother's birthday with the Motherhood Cross medals. The idea being that they wanted to celebrate motherhood because they believed that in the 1920s, during the Golden Age, there was less celebration of motherhood and more women were starting to see their role as being outside of the home. So they wanted to try and put in ceremonies that would celebrate women having lots of children and give them something to aim for. If you had 4 children, you got a bronze medal. If you had 6 children, you got a silver medal. And if you had 8 children, you got a gold medal. If you had 10 children, your 10th child would have Hitler as their legal godparent. So this was something that many women tried to aim for. The Nazis also wanted to try and discourage birth control for obvious reasons, try and increase the birth rate, and anti-abortion was more strictly enforced. Now, even during the so-called sexual freedom for women in the 1920s, they hadn't been able to have abortions legally. And remember that up to 12,000 women a year died in Germany from these botched abortions. So the Nazis just made it even more difficult than it was in Weimar to get these abortions. Women were also encouraged to adopt a healthy lifestyle with plenty of exercise, which is supposed to make a difference when it comes to things like conceiving. And they also wanted to try and stop women having abortions with things like the Lebensborn programme. Now, this is something that was introduced by Himmler and the SS in 1935, because remember that the SS had a role of being this kind of elite Aryan organisation, and therefore there was definitely a racial element to this group. Initially, these were at first homes for unmarried mothers of so-called pure babies, basically to try and detract from the fact that many women would end up being, socially isolated and kicked out of their homes if they'd had a child out of wedlock. So they wanted to try and put in place these homes for unmarried mothers. Now, by the time we get to World War II, these places become more extreme and they end up becoming brothels where someone would go deliberately to have a child by a racially pure SS officer. And 11,000 children were born by this programme. So it's important that you know the policies, but also that you think about to what extent they were successful with this. Now, it can't be disagreed with that the birth rate did increase. So they did massively increase the birth rate from 1933, and it peaked in 1939, which is no surprise before the outbreak of World War II. However, even though they were successful to an extent, they never reached pre-Weimar levels, and there's also an argument that it's not just down to Nazi policies. One of the key things that affects how many children people have is the economic conditions, and obviously the Nazis were benefiting from the fact that there had been a recovery from the Great Depression, and their economic policies had benefited lots of Aryan Germans as well. So it wasn't just down to these policies that the Nazis managed to increase the birth rate. You could even think about the fact that the economic conditions also played a role as well. The second Nazi aim was to try and reduce female employment, which has been closely linked to the idea of raising the birth rate, because if women didn't feel the need to work as much, then they might have a bigger family. Now, the Nazis made their ideas about women working clear from 1921, when they had outlined their party structure, which excluded women from senior positions. They generally wanted to reverse the changes from the 1920s, where women were supposedly freer to have more access to jobs and equal opportunities. Now, even though there had been some positive strides for women in the 1920s, the new woman was a myth to a certain extent, and the amount of women that actually got jobs in the 1920s didn't really increase very much from pre-Weimar Republic years. So it was mainly working class women that worked at this point, although there were greater numbers of middle class women who took up new professions that they had previously been discouraged from. Now, the Nazis didn't pass lots of laws directly banning women from these different jobs, but they did try and put social pressure on women to give up themselves, or at least put the pressure on their employers to not favour them and to potentially not hire any new women, and even encourage women to give up the jobs that they already had. So between 1933 and 1936, women found it very difficult to get jobs in medicine, law, and the higher ranks of the civil service. The Nazis even used laws that we've discussed before, like the April 1933 Law for the Re-establishment of a Professional Civil Service, to try and get rid of some women from these jobs. Now, this did have an impact on lots of different women, but it mainly had an impact on middle-class women, because middle-class women were more likely to have an education and to end up with those more professional jobs in things like medicine and law. So it did affect middle-class women, but these were generally a very small group of society, and very few women were negatively impacted by these policies. Lots of women actually liked the idea of having to give up their job because they were supported by things like the marriage loans and also the breaks in income tax. Now, in terms of the statistics and how much of an impact they actually had on women, the percentage of women did decrease between 1932 and 1937. So the percentage of the total workforce that was women did decrease from 37% down to 31%. However, because the amount of people working increased in this time period, the actual number of women working increased because that overall employment rate was growing. So the Nazis didn't necessarily achieve these aims of trying to get all women back into the home and not working. Lots of women still needed to work to be able to take care of their families. or even, work to try and generate enough of an income to even start a family. So they didn't achieve their aim of getting all women to give up their jobs. They didn't mind women working certain jobs as well, like they allowed women to work as midwives, which they saw as a female specialist role. So in terms of their success then, when it came to reducing female employment, the number of women in the workforce increased as Nazi ideology also had to give way to economic realities, especially later on. When it comes to things like the 4-year plan, and there's a labour shortage because they've sacked, for instance, all Jewish people, they need more women working. And certainly by the time we get to 1943, when the war is turning in favour against the Nazis, they also need to ask all women between the ages of 17 and 45 to work as well. So there is a little bit of a contrast here between the needs of the economy and actually Nazi ideology. And even though they wanted to try and get women to give up their jobs, more women did actually end up working overall, even though the percentage of women working in terms of the total population decreased. The third key policy was to try and encourage women to follow Nazi values. Now, just like with the youth, they wanted to try and make sure that women felt that they were part of the Volksgemeinschaft. Obviously, when it comes to the youth, we've seen how they've done that through education and by controlling their private time. And the same stands here for women, where they want to try and organise and incorporate women into the Volksgemeinschaft by getting them to join Nazi organisations that will stress their ideology. Now, there's two to know about. There's the German Women's League, or the DFW, and also the National Socialist Women's Organisation, the NSF. Now, the first one we're going to think about is the German Women's League. Now, this generally was less political than when you compare it to the National Socialist Women's Organisation. This was a group that brought together lots of different groups that used to exist in Weimar Germany. The idea was that they would help out with lots of different things like farming, nursing, domestic jobs and other activities. They didn't wear uniforms, but instead, when you were a female worker, or just a female generally, you might add things like a membership pin or patches to your clothing. Now, this was a large organisation that had 6 million members, and there were little organisations within it as well. Just like within the German Labour Front, their replacement for trade unions, organisations like Strength Through Joy were part of it. It's the same here with the German Women's League, where they have the official organisation of the DFW, but then they also had subsidiary organisations as well, like the Reich Mother's Service, which ended up providing 1.7 million women with motherhood training services by 1939. So that's the German Women's League. Now, the other one to know about is the National Socialist Women's Organisation, which is much more political and something that was formed in 1931. This was much more about stressing Nazi ideology and was an elite organisation where they tried to plan how they would spread propaganda about ideology for women. And they did manage, both of these organisations, to be quite successful and managed to achieve much greater female participation in Nazi organisations and reduced opposition from women as well, because they made a lot of women see the positives of Nazi policies. Obviously, if they were an Aryan woman that was also able to fit their ideal by having lots of children. So you don't need to know loads of details about those, but you need to be aware that there was those different organisations trying to reduce opposition and encourage women to follow Nazi values. So it feeds into those earlier two aims that we've discussed already. And you shouldn't need to be able to name her in an exam, but just in case a source comes up, these organisations, both of them, were led by a lady called Gertrude Stolz-Klink. So she wasn't, a key Nazi Party member as such. She didn't have very much power apart from over these women's organisations, which the Nazis believed needed to be run by a woman. Just like with the youth, it's really important that you start to think about your own view on how successful Nazi policies towards women were, because if they give you an exam question on this, they would be expecting you to make a judgment about what were the main kind of strengths or weaknesses of their policies, to what extent did they achieve their aims. Now, to help you with this, there are some historians' views that you could use to either agree or disagree with in your answer. You might decide that you want to, for instance, critique the person called Bock that we talked about in lessons, where we talked about how he argued it was a kind of secondary racism with their policies towards women. You might want to think about historians like Frevert, who talked about the fact that women who satisfied the political, racial and social requirements did not perceive it as a women's hell, and that actually a lot of their policies were quite appealing. So there's a lot of historians that argue that many women ended up supporting the Nazis and that their policies were pretty popular. But you can also think about your own argument within that and whether you're going to see it from a different point of view. So pause the video here to maybe write down your own little summary of what you think about whether the Nazis were successful in their policies towards women. As part of Unit 4.4, you do need to know about Nazi policies towards the workers, but remember this is in a separate video in 4.31 on economic policies from 35 minutes onwards. So what you really need to make sure that you know about the workers in Nazi Germany is what their aims were towards the workers, what the economic policies were and their impact on the workers as well, including things like how they created the German Labour Front, the DAF, and the Strength Through Joy movement, the KDF. You also need to be very aware of how the workers benefited from their policies and also how they were worse off as a result too, and also opposition from the workers. And once you've looked at all those areas, just like you've done with women and the youth, you can also think about your own argument for to what extent the Nazis were successful when it came to those policies towards the workers. So remember to go back and look at 4.3 later on, or pause this video here and go and look at that now. The next area that you need to know about for Unit 4.4 is Nazi policies towards both the Catholic and the Protestant Church and how they differed. Now, Hitler in terms of religion was never that open with what he said because he was very wary of upsetting German people by saying something that they would find offensive. But we can see what he thinks about it from this record of a personal conversation that he had in 1933. He said, "Catholic and Protestant, they are both the same. Neither of them has any future left. That won't stop me from stamping out Christianity in Germany, root and branch. One is either a Christian or a German. You can't be both." So Hitler's aims when it came to the church was to try and control them, in part of the trying to create this people's community and trying to coordinate the different groups as part of Gleichschaltung. The church was obviously a crucial part of that. So he wants to try and gain control over the churches, and then later on he wants to try and weaken their influence. But he doesn't know exactly how to do that because he's got to think about trying to change these views that have been embedded in the German people for so long. 58% of the German population were Protestant and 32% of them were Catholic. So he's trying to kind of change people's ideas, things that have been embedded in their families for generations, and he knew that this was a really delicate issue, hence why at first he proceeds with quite a cautious stance, especially towards the Catholic Church, to basically try and lure them into a false sense of security. As you know already, one of the Nazi aims towards the church was to try and gain control over the churches and then later weaken their influence. Now, the Nazis believed that the Protestant church would be easier for them to be able to coordinate and control because generally they held lots of similar views to the Nazis. They were generally the people that supported the Protestant church, nationalistic, and therefore they held these right-wing views, anti-communist and anti-Semitic. Therefore, there were some points of convergence between Nazi ideology and the Protestants. For instance, we have a little look at the breakdown of where the support was for the Nazis. Generally, the Nazis did the best in the 1932 elections in the areas where there were lots of Protestants, for instance, in the north and east of Germany. Now, the Nazis also believed that the Protestant church would be the easiest to be able to control because it was a divided church. It wasn't like the Catholics where it was one united organisation, but instead there were 28 different separate state churches in 1933. So Hitler decided the way to control the church was to unite all of the different Protestant churches together in a single national church called the Reich Church, which he did in 1933. Now, generally, the Protestant leaders showed support for the Nazis by allowing this to happen, and they also showed their support with mass weddings that were organised between the SA, the brown shirts, and their brides in the first months of the Nazi regime. There were even things like swastikas put up inside these church buildings to try and show that they supported the Nazi state. Now, the person that was in charge of the Reich Church, the Nazi church, was somebody called Ludwig Müller, who's not the same as the Heinrich Müller that was originally in charge of the Gestapo. So Ludwig Müller became the new Reich bishop, and he got rid of all the elected bodies within the church, and he made sure that they followed Nazi rules. For instance, now that it was the Nazi church, they introduced something called the Aryan paragraph, which allowed the dismissal of Jewish converted Christians. So Jewish people who had now converted to Christianity were kicked out of the church. And there were over 18 church leaders who were dismissed as a result of that Aryan paragraph. So generally, the fact that we have this Nazi Reich Church led by Ludwig Müller, and we have the fact that these 28 different churches have been combined, demonstrates that actually the Reich Church was generally coordinating the Volksgemeinschaft. The Protestants themselves were therefore generally coordinated. There was only a small group of them that actually rose up against this and criticised Nazi policy of blending the church and the state. Most historians argue that the Nazis were much more successful at coordinating the Protestant Church than they were the Catholic Church. However, not all Protestants were supportive of the idea of the Reich Church that had been established in 1933. For instance, Niemöller and Bonhoeffer were two really important figures who established something called the Pastors Emergency League in September 1933, which then turned into something called the Confessional Church. Now, this wasn't a small amount of opposition. This was an opponent group, or an opposition group, that was joined by 5,000 pastors out of 17,000 Protestant pastors that there were in Germany. So this was a clear act of resistance. Now, Niemöller talked about how we must obey God rather than man, and they would generally oppose the idea that the state had interfered with the church, and they believed that it should be separate to the Nazi state. So they generally resisted state interference in the church and wanted to re-establish theology based solely on the Bible. They didn't like things like the Aryan paragraph. They wanted people to be able to convert to Christianity and not be persecuted based on that. Therefore, they were opposing the Nazis and their policy of the Reich Church and their efforts to try and control the church, and shows that actually their policy towards trying to coordinate the Protestant Church into the Volksgemeinschaft as part of this policy of Gleichschaltung was not fully successful. Now, the Nazis didn't like the fact that there was any opposition or any opponents to their religious policy, so they responded with increased repression, just like they did later on with the Catholic Church as well. So out of those 5,000 pastors that joined the Confessional Church, by 1937, over 700 of them had been imprisoned, including one of the leaders, Niemöller, and they tried to also marginalise Christianity as a result of this as well. So, for instance, they tried to get all church schools to be abolished in the late 1930s and tried to get some people as well to try and renounce their church membership. So as a result of that, 100,000 Christians left the church in 1937, and 5% of the population were no longer formally members of the church. But despite the fact that the Nazis tried to respond with repression to crush the Confessional Church, the Nazis actually never successfully silenced it. Yet most members professed loyalty to the regime, so it was not generally about opposing the Nazis and going against everything they believed in. It was more about these people arguing that the Nazis shouldn't have a role in the church itself. So the Nazis were in a difficult position. They had to try and make sure that they repressed this opposition, but also not to the extent that they were going to alienate Protestant supporters, which had been so crucial to them coming to power. So in conclusion, thinking about the success of Protestant opposition, despite the fact that there were some limitations to success, despite the fact that the Confessional Church existed and had a significant amount of support, with almost a third of the Protestant leaders joining it, they were generally more successful at coordinating the Protestant Church still than they were with the Catholics. You also need to know about Nazi policies towards the Catholics and how this differed from the Protestants. Now, the Catholics were a smaller group in German society and made up about 32% of the population, or about 22 million people. Now, for the Nazis, they represented a greater obstacle to Nazi ideas because they were part of an international church that took religious instruction from the Pope, and therefore they were a greater threat for the Nazis because they were less susceptible than the Protestant church, which the Nazis were able to coordinate together to create the Reich Church. The Catholics generally were less likely to support Hitler in elections because they had their own party, the Centre Party, which had done quite well in the history of Weimar. However, once the Nazis had come to power and once they had shown that they were the dominant party, the Church and the Catholic Church was generally more prepared to compromise with the regime, especially as at that point during the Great Depression, they regarded communism as a greater evil than Nazism. They compromised with the Nazis early on when Hitler first became Chancellor, and that's shown by the fact that they voluntarily disbanded their Catholic trade unions after other trade unions were banned in May 1933 using the Enabling Act, and they also voluntarily disbanded their own political party, the Centre Party, in July 1933, just before the Nazis banned all other political parties. They even then signed the Concordat in July 1933, which was an agreement between the Nazis and the Catholics that they created to try and preserve its own independence and autonomy. The Concordat agreement, which you should know from Unit 3.4, was an agreement that the Church would not interfere in politics as long as the Nazis agreed that they would not interfere with the practices of the Church. For instance, they were supposed to leave things like the Catholic youth groups alone, Catholic schools, and to try and make sure that they preserved the Catholic traditions amongst some sections of society in Germany. The deal that was struck in 1933 was supposed to see the Nazis leave the Catholic Church alone. However, by the time we get to the end of 1933, Hitler had started to break the terms of that Concordat agreement. For instance, he was doing things like seizing property of Catholic lay organisations, and by 1935 he had done things like banning crucifixes. Now that had led to some individual Catholic priests starting to speak out against Nazism from their pulpits. They were only doing this to protect the influence of the Church, and they were not attacking the Nazis and their more immoral policies generally. They were only thinking here about the autonomy of the Church. So we've got some examples here of where some individual Catholic priests are rising up against Nazis and suggesting that their policies are wrong. Now, just like with the Protestant Church, when they created the Confessional Church, the Nazis responded to this opposition with increasing pressure on the Church and more repression. For instance, what the Nazis did to the Catholics is in 1936 they made the Hitler Youth Movement, given the status of an official education movement, and they closed down all other youth groups, including the Catholic youth groups, to try and make sure that the Nazis were demonstrating to the Catholic Church that they had more power and that they had more influence over the lives of young people. Now that really upset the Catholic organisations because they were worried about the future of Catholicism if young people weren't growing up as engaged with the Catholic community. So the Pope ended up getting involved in 1937, and he wrote an encyclical called With Burning Concern or With Burning Grief, which was to be read out in the pulpits of lots of different Catholic churches throughout Germany. Now, this was a really big deal because this is the one time that the Catholic Church placed itself in open conflict with the regime. In this letter, the Pope had issued, he was talking about the Nazis and condemning them for their treatment of the Church, and hoping that this would lead to the Catholic youth groups being opened again. However, the Nazis just responded with even more repression. They did things like getting the Gestapo to spy on church organisations, they closed down monasteries, they seized their assets, they removed all crucifixes from schools, and they closed down all Catholic schools by 1939. Now this upset a lot of Catholics, but not enough for them to place themselves in opposition to the regime. Instead, many older Catholics just showed their support for the regime by continuing to attend church services. So to summarise with the Catholics, we have to think about how successful were Nazi policies towards them. Now, as we just mentioned, there were lots of older Catholics who continued to show their support for the church by continuing to attend the church services. However, there is no denying the fact that by 1939, the power and influence of the Catholics had been severely weakened because the church and its priests were intimidated and forced to retreat. The Nazis had wanted to try and weaken church influence by controlling the youths, and that was generally quite effective, but actually the older Catholics generally kept their faith. Now, overall, the Catholics never placed themselves in open conflict with the regime. They didn't organise any great resistance. They weren't criticising the Nazis generally. They were just concerned with trying to preserve their autonomy. The only time that the Catholic Church was successful in stopping the Nazis was during the Second World War from 1941, when the Bishop von Galen ended up preaching publicly about the euthanasia programme and ended up getting it halted. But we'll talk more about that in Unit 5 and 6. So you might want to pause the video here and think about your own ideas about whether the Nazis were more successful in their policies towards the Catholics or the Protestants. As you'll have noticed, the Nazis' aims towards the church was generally quite confused, and they didn't have a coherent policy. Their general aim had been to try and weaken the church and then eventually get rid of it. But then there had been some other things that contradicted that. For instance, Hitler in the 25-point programme that had been published in 1920 talked not about getting rid of the church, probably because he was quite aware of upsetting the German public, but instead talked about a positive Christianity which was linked to racial and nationalistic views. However, this didn't really fit with what the churches wanted, and so there was some issues where obviously their ideas were fundamentally opposed. Now, there was also some other Nazis that had different views to Hitler, where they wanted to replace the churches altogether with a new Nazi faith called the German Faith Movement. Now, the idea of this was create an alternative religion that would reject Christianity and instead be based on pre-Christian paganism. Now, this isn't something that you need to know as in depth as the Protestant Church and policies towards the Catholic Church, because this was generally a failure with only 40,000 members at its peak. Even Hitler himself wasn't actually a member of this religion. So it was never more than a fringe cult. But what's important about the German faith movement is that it shows how incoherent Nazi policy was. Not even all party members agreed on what the policy towards the church should be and what the new religion of Germany should be like once they'd weakened the influence of the churches. This is the last slide on Nazi policies towards the church, and this is where you need to think about your own judgments about did the Nazis achieve their aims towards the church, and which church were they more successful at coordinating. So generally we need to start off with thinking about Hitler's aims in order to think about whether they achieved it. Now obviously the church was a potential obstacle to Hitler's reordering of the German people into committed followers of his totalitarian regime. Hitler didn't have a coherent policy. The Nazis were constantly torn between a policy of total suppression, which might alienate most Germans, and limited suppression, which would allow the church too much independence. So at first he wanted to be able to try and gain control over the churches before later on weakening their influence and potentially in the future replacing it with a new type of religion. Now, in terms of what we've got on here, to start off, we've got some historians' views, which you can use in your answers from Noakes and Wright. Noakes talked about the churches being the only institutions that had an alternative ideology and the only ones who were permitted to retain their own organisational autonomy. So he's suggesting that the Nazis failed to completely achieve their aims to do with the church. Then if we look at Wright, he's talking about how the churches were severely handicapped but not destroyed. Hitler's programme needed time. He himself was destroyed before it had taken root. So he's suggesting that it potentially would have been more successful had the Nazis been able to stay in power after the Second World War. So some conclusions on the church which you could use in your answer. You could think about the fact that the church was the one key institution that the Nazis failed to coordinate, and therefore they only achieved limited success. You could also talk about the criticism of the church and the fact that they failed to be able to mount good and effective opposition to the Nazis because of their lack of criticism of the regime, and they failed to challenge the immoral nature of the regime. Or you could talk about the fact that some individuals were incredibly brave, but they only generally rose up and said something against the Nazis when church organisations were threatened, or you could even think about how Christian faith generally remained strong and increased during World War II. So it is clear that organised religion obviously wasn't destroyed and actually remained a powerful force within German society. So there's elements of it being a Nazi failure. But I'd like to pause the video here and put down your own views about to what extent were the Nazis successful? Were they more successful with one church than the other? So make sure you're thinking about your judgment here. You've now looked at the key points for the youth, women, workers and the church. And now we just want to think about tying it all together and thinking about certain questions that could come up in exams. For instance, the idea of to what extent did the Nazi regime bring about a social revolution in Germany in the years 1933 to 1945? Now, for this question, you'd have to think about how the Nazis aimed to try and transform German society and about how they wanted to try and persuade the German people to put aside their different interests in favour of an overarching loyalty to the greater national cause. Remember that in Weimar Germany, the political divide had been enormous and had really influenced the way that people felt about German society. So they wanted to try and create this Nazi Volksgemeinschaft, which would be a society in which there was social harmony based on a shared racial purity. Obviously for only those people that were included in the Volksgemeinschaft, and obviously there was mistreatment of those that were considered not to be part of this German people's community. As part of the Volksgemeinschaft, the Nazis didn't want to allow any independent organisations or alternative ideologies, which would then be able to divide German society. So you need to think about your own views about how much did Germany really change under the Nazis? To what extent did they come up with a social revolution? Or would you say that the changes weren't revolutionary? So in some ways, we could say that Germany in 1945 was very different to that of 1933, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the Nazis achieved everything they wanted to with this Volksgemeinschaft. They didn't necessarily succeed in coordinating all organisations. You know, we could think about the fact that they failed with elements like the Catholic Church, and actually their policies did not necessarily last long term. You know, some of the organisations that they created and the political allegiance to the Nazi Party disappeared quite quickly after the Nazi Party fell in 1945. So start thinking about to what extent you would think there was a social revolution and to what extent these changes were really embedded in German society. Or was it just down to the influence of things like the terror state that it appeared there had been maybe greater changes than there actually were? This is a really big issue, and if you struggled with that last question, don't worry about it because it is an enormous question to think about how much the Nazis really changed German society. Now on the next couple of slides, there's some historians' views on this that you might use to kind of come up with your own ideas about to what extent the Nazis had won the support of the people and to what extent they changed German society. For instance, we've got here about the ideas of Peuker and Newman, who argue that the impact on German society was minimal, and they talked about the fact that actually Nazi ideology and this idea of this social revolution was kind of empty rhetoric. On the other hand, there have been some historians that have argued that the Nazis did cause revolutionary social changes, but it may be better to agree with the latter, as if much of Nazi ideology was without substance, then why would it be able to achieve the levels of support it did, especially in the 1930s? So there's some historians' views there if you're looking for an A or an A star, but you don't have to remember all of those different names. On the next slide, we've got some more information about some different historians' views, which again you can use in any exam answer on the impact of social policies. So you should have seen this slide before in lesson. Obviously, we've got here some general statistics talking about to what extent people supported the Nazis. And then we've got lots of different historians' views here about to what extent they have the support of the people. So you can use some of these in exam answers if you want to. Don't write them all down, just make sure you picked out a couple that you maybe think are the best ones to be able to use to support your arguments. Well done for getting to the end of this video. Now just a reminder that for Unit 4.4 there is a short answer test that's quite long, it's got 38 questions on it, which talks about all the different categories from this video. So all about the youth, women, the workers and the church. Now, obviously, this is a condensed version. 4.4 is a really big topic. There is also on Teams some separate ones, for instance, just 30 questions or so on the youth, just questions on women, just questions on the workers, which you can look at if you want to. But when I'm doing tests in lesson, I'll only ever test you on these 38 together. Otherwise, we'd be doing a short answer test every lesson. I'm sure you recognise this slide from all my other videos. The idea is that you now make sure that you do something with this information. So if you found a particular section hard, you might spend a little while longer revising that. You might try another red pen, black pen activity, writing down everything you can remember on, for instance, policies towards women now, and then you might go back and look over certain sections again and add things that you missed in second colour. Or you might decide that a good idea would be to plan out some exam questions. Now, there's lots of different questions on Unit 4, especially 4.4. There's lots of really good source questions, and remember, all of the sources and all the past papers are all on Teams, which you can go and look at. There's lots of different sources, for instance, out there on the youth if you want to have a practice of that. Or you could even have a go at planning out an essay question. For instance, how successful were the Nazis in bringing about revolutionary social changes in the Volksgemeinschaft? So well done for getting to the end of that video. Make sure you do something now which consolidates your knowledge.